Hey guys, this is Dave, and I have the new Dunu Vulkan 2. And I know I always talk about how I really like the $200 price bracket because it seems like that's just a super competitive price point right now. But I also have been kind of keeping an eye on the $500 to $600 price bracket because while I know that is a little more out of reach, I guess, for a lot of hobbyists, I feel like there's a lot of innovation and competition happening in that budget range as well. And performance levels that used to maybe cost, I don't know, $800, $900, $1,000 now can be had for $500 or $600. And for a lot of hobbyists, that kind of performance can almost be in-game. So the Vulkan 2 kind of lands right in between those two price brackets at $359. So it's not quite $500 and it's not quite $200. And as far as what I'm looking for in terms of performance with the Vulkan 2, I've got several IEMs that I've been comparing this with, and they're pretty impressive sets, and they all kind of fall within this $300 to $450 price bracket. And I think I have a pretty good idea of where this stands in terms of overall performance and value. So as usual, we'll go over the contents of the box. We'll talk about the specifications, the design, and then we'll get into sound. We have a lot to talk about, so let's get started. Okay, so as far as what you get in the box, in typical Dunu fashion, they've appointed the Vulkan 2 quite nicely. You've got the IEMs and cable, of course, and the cable is modular, so they've also included a 3.5 and a 4.4 interchangeable termination. A really nice case, although the case is a little on the larger side. They've also provided lots and lots of ear tips and a couple of cases to put the tips in, a little IEM pouch, a cleaning cloth, a cleaning tool, and a headphone adapter. And again, they've priced this at $359. It has a hybrid driver setup with 2 dynamic drivers and 6 balanced armature drivers per side. Now, as far as the design of the shells, I do like it, although I do think I like the design of the original Vulkan a little bit more. But this is nice, and it certainly does still have that Dunu quality that I've come to expect. It has this kind of a champagne gold finish, and I'm not sure how well the color will translate in my B-roll, but it looks really, really good in person. And the cable looks really good with the IEMs as well. The quality of the cable is very good, although it's not maybe super soft. Not that I would say it's stiff necessarily. It is still very manageable, and it's certainly soft enough to roll up and to store pretty easily. And again, it is a modular cable, and it uses Dunu's patented Q-Lock mini system, which is really quite easy to use. Fit and comfort are really good, especially with the included SNS tips. And for those of you that know me, I absolutely love those tips. But as soon as I open this up, I just put those tips on and I got a really comfortable fit right away. And I did try maybe a few other tips, but I just ended up going back to these SNS tips and I haven't taken them off since. So in terms of just the overall design, the build quality, comfort, the accessories, I have no complaints at all. And as expected, I think Dunu put together a great package for the $359 asking price. But of course, the question is, how does it sound? Well, let's talk about that. Okay, so in terms of the tuning approach they took with the Vulkan 2, it's pretty different, especially when you compare it with pretty much all of my favorites in this price range. And I've got some of those on the table, and all of these have slight variations in their upper, mids, and treble, especially when compared with the Vulkan 2. But where the Vulkan 2 really deviates or differentiates itself from these is in its lower mid-range. And you can call it a scoop, you can call it a tuck, but basically what they've done is reduced the lower mids quite a bit, again, relative to these other sets. And that can be a little bit risky sometimes if you're not careful, because if you reduce it too much, it can cause its presentation to sound a little thin or even unnatural. Plus, depending on how much energy you have in the upper, mids, and treble, if you've got too much energy in the top half of the tuning, then you reduce the lower mid-range and bass, then you also run the risk of the presentation becoming shouty and or unbalanced. So how does the Vulkan 2 handle this? Well, actually, I think they did a really good job. And while I wouldn't necessarily say this is the most balanced set out there, and it can even at times come across as a little thin, I do think they've relaxed the upper, mids, and treble enough. And it is definitely below Harman, but it's enough to keep it from falling into that shouty territory. And its presentation and just its general tuning is balanced enough and natural enough so that it still works well with most music genres. Not all genres, but most. I probably would not recommend this set to anyone whose library consists of a lot of rap or maybe even EDM, because I don't know if it's really going to be able to deliver the necessary levels of bass and sub bass that those genres might require. But with almost everything else, because of this neutral approach they took with its tuning, and also because of the steps they took to reduce the upper mids and the treble to compensate for the reduction in the lower mid-range, I actually feel like it works pretty well. So I guess in terms of its general bass energy, so if we were to kind of break things down, just looking at the bass, in terms of its bass energy or the bass quantity, when you contrast that against the upper, mids, and treble, I do at times feel like maybe my attention is being pulled towards the top half of its tuning. So I guess you could say its balance does tilt maybe a little bit towards the upper, mids, and treble. And for me, what that means, based on my tuning preference, I would have preferred to see a little more bass energy to offset that. However, I would also say that the bass energy is still sufficient overall. And I would also say the bass quality is good as far as bass speed, bass texture, bass control, but because it is a little more relaxed in the mid bass, I don't really feel like I'm experiencing the full potential of its dynamics, its punch, the impact. And while, again, I don't know if I would consider this thin, because it does have pretty decent note weight and it does have a little bit of a richness in its presentation, but I do still wish there was, again, just a little more low mid-range energy and more bass energy. Because again, while I don't think it falls into that thin territory necessarily, I do think it's kind of edging maybe a little close. Now, as you move up the graph, the rest of the mid-range sounds really, really good. So despite maybe some of that energy missing in the lower mids, it still sounds very natural. And also, despite maybe the upper mids being a little more relaxed than what you might see with a typical maybe Harman style approach for the upper mids, because of that reduced energy in the lower mid-range, again, the bass, there's still more than enough upper mid-range and vocal energy to keep vocals front and center. But for me, I think what still keeps this IEM in the game is just basically how naturally it presents vocals and instruments. And everything just sounds generally correct, but it also brings pretty impressive levels of clarity and resolution to its mid-range presentation as well. And I also feel like they did a really great job with how they approached the treble tuning. And in terms of treble energy, when contrasted with the upper mid-range energy, I feel like they got that just right, because there's certainly good coherence, and it's just a good natural between the treble, between the upper mids. It just sounds really, really natural. However, though, when you contrast that energy against the lower half of the tuning, I just feel like the presentation is maybe a little bit top heavy. But again, from almost every other measure, so treble naturalness, treble extension, air, its ability to handle recordings that maybe have a little bit of sibilance, and even just in terms of general treble refinement, despite its presentation maybe being a little bit bright, I do feel like, or at least leaning bright, maybe not bright, but leans bright. I do feel like they otherwise got a lot of things right in the top half. Now, as far as technical performance, it's very, very good. There might be a few other sets out there that maybe can beat it barely, but its technical performance, I would still consider this above average, and I don't think it falls very far behind some of the best within this price range, in my opinion, because detail levels are very good. The soundstage is pretty wide for an IEM. Layering and separation is good. Instrument and vocal imaging and focus are also very good. So in terms of its general technical performance, I would consider this above average for where they priced this. Now, as far as comparisons, when compared with the DaVinci, I would say its detail levels are probably better than the DaVinci, and maybe even better than the Volume S, probably about on par with the Performer 8, but not quite to the levels of the Pilgrim, and probably not quite to the levels of the Studio 4 either. But it's in the tuning where I think this maybe deviates maybe a little too far from my preference. But I guess in case you're curious, here are some rough comparison. So compared with the DaVinci is obviously going to be much warmer, much smoother in its upper mids and treble. It has more bass energy and just vocal energy. And to me, it's the DaVinci is just more balanced. And I don't have the Performer 8 here, but I think that does warrant comparison. So the Performer 8 is also more balanced overall. I feel like, at least in my opinion, it has more lower mid and more mid-bass presence. The vocals are maybe a little more relaxed than the Vulcan 2, but it's also just generally more natural sounding to me than the Vulcan 2. Now, as far as the Pilgrim, interestingly, if you were to take the graph of the Pilgrim and overlay it with the Vulcan 2 on paper, there are actually a lot of similarities in the upper mids and treble, although the Pilgrim does have maybe a little more upper treble energy. But the thing is there are pretty significant differences in the lower mids between the two. And when you factor the reduced lower mids and bass energy of the Vulcan 2 compared with the Pilgrim, all of the similarities in the top half are almost completely negated. And the Pilgrim is just generally more balanced, it's more engaging, it's more dynamic, and it also has just better overall technical performance. And then when you compare it with the Studio 4, it also has more lower mid-range and bass energy, just like the rest of these other sets. The Studio 4 is more balanced, it's more natural sounding, and it's also just a more technical set. And based on my tuning preference, I would probably be more likely to reach for probably any one of these sets over the Vulcan 2. Now, all that said, if you take into consideration the fact that these sets are all exceptional for their price points, they're all exceptionally well tuned. So I'm comparing the Vulcan 2 with some pretty great sets, but in the context of the rest of the market. For me personally, while the Vulcan 2 doesn't necessarily come super close to my tuning preference, it's not really so far off that I was not able to still experience a lot of enjoyment, especially since my library has a ton of acoustic, a ton of jazz, classical, vocal, and here's where I think I might need to clarify something. I was still able to thoroughly enjoy listening to those other genres that I talked about that might benefit from this having more bass, like EDM, for example. There was still enough bass to make me feel like I was seeing the whole picture, and the picture was complete enough, especially, again, when you factor in its bass quality, then you factor in its technical capabilities, not to mention the excellent fit, its excellent build quality, and just, again, how well appointed it is in terms of accessories. As a whole package, it's still a very, very good IEM, and it's definitely worth taking into consideration if it falls within your budget range, and of course if it fits your tuning preference based on the information I've provided. But anyways, hopefully that gives you a pretty good idea of where I stand with the Vulkan 2. Thank you guys so much for taking the time to watch. If you like my content, please take a second and hit that subscribe button. Also, if you would please like this video, please share this video, please comment on this video. I hope you have an awesome day.